Okay, something dings up.
I think questions might be appearing along here in text form. They weren't super sure about that. But. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining our Industry Circle session with Filament Games. For those of you who don't know about Games for Change, we are a not-for-profit that supports the games creators and social innovators to drive real-world impact using digital games. We have a program called the Industry Circle. This is our third year of running the program, and it is an opportunity for us to share best practices and methods by industry leaders that have made significant contributions to the gaming community. And we're very excited to host the first session of this year, at this year's Industry Circle, with a live session and a Q&A on VR for Learning by Filament Games. After the session, questions can be submitted using the hashtag G4C Industry or through the YouTube chat tool on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. So please start thinking about your questions, because you will have an opportunity to have them answered after Filament gives a short presentation. So let me tell you a little bit about the Industry Circle, and then I will about our co-host, Filament Games. So the 2017-18 Industry Circle is comprised of 5 game studios that have made significant impact in our community and have shown best practices in driving this industry forward. This cycle's companies that are participating are Filament Games, Classcraft, Eline Media, Shell Games, Triceum, and Yogame, all of whom you'll hear about more in 2018. But now let me speak a little bit about our co-host, Filament Games. Filament is a production studio that exclusively creates learning games. As a leader in the game-based learning industry, the company combines best practices in commercial game development with key concepts from the learning sciences. They have an award-winning suite of learning games that have been implemented in districts across the country and are currently forging new paths towards educational uses for the medium of virtual reality. We are really excited to have them share with us some of their work and offering tips and insights for those of you who are interested in working in the sector, whether it's games or in virtual reality. So please let me welcome Jennifer and Dan, who will introduce themselves from Filament Games.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Dan, obviously. This is my colleague, Jennifer. And that was a very nice introduction. Thank you, Suzanne. To add to that, Filament's mission is to create playful experiences that improve people's lives. So what does it actually mean in practice? As a game development studio, we care, like any other game development studio, a lot about what kind of experience the player has inside of the game. But the thing that sets us apart from a lot of game development studios out there is that we care also a lot about what happens to the player after they play the game. So in what way does the game transform them? And that could be teaching them something. It could be allowing them to adopt a new mindset or new perspective, to change a behavior, or what have you. So every game project that we do is a little bit different in terms of learning objectives, different in terms of target demographic, and apropos to this conversation today, different in terms of platform as well. We develop for all the traditional platforms, all the screens that you're probably thinking of. But of course, we're here today to talk about one of the newest and coolest screens, which is the screen that you attach to your face via head-mounted display, and that is virtual reality, and as a sub-bullet of that, augmented and mixed reality. So that's us in a nutshell. Shall I continue?
Hi, everyone. My name is Asif Khan. I'm Senior Director for Partnerships and Programs at Games for Change. Very excited. This is my first webinar and super excited as Filament Games. Huge fan of the work that they do and really interested in learning more about the work and getting some of the audience questions as well to ask Dan and Jennifer. My first question is, how do you design for learning when the subject matter is difficult to operationalize? For example, designing a game to teach creativity or empathy skills rather than mathematics or language, which is sometimes a little more easier to teach someone. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about designing subject matters that aren't traditional, that might be something that isn't something that teachers usually teach. So if you could get a little bit more insight into using your skills to design subject matter that is not traditional in the sense, and if you've had success doing that, if you haven't had success doing that, any lessons learned there would be great to hear.
Yeah, so really we're talking about teaching soft skills like 21st century skills, creativity, collaboration, systems thinking, things of that nature. Yeah, so whether or not you're using games as a pedagogy, teaching something like creativity is very difficult because it is partially learned and it's partially innate. So we take responsibility for the learned part. And you can't obviously tell somebody how to be creative, but you can give them the types of experiences that they might have as a creative person. And you can also look at what creative people do and how they think and how they behave. And you can try to instantiate those same thought patterns and paradigms and behaviors in the game environment. So if you really want to get reductionist about it, you can think about a game environment as a scaffolding space. Basically, we take the player on at point A and we drop them off at point B. And between point A and point B, we scaffold them as much as possible towards some desired outcome. And so when you're talking about creativity, or the desired outcome is for the person to be creative, a lot of times that's just as simple as giving them lots of practice at creativity, a lot of opportunities to be creative, and then that scaffolding that I mentioned, the things that make it so it's not just an open sandbox space where they can flounder if they have no idea how to get started, but opportunities to practice along with the scaffolding that points them in the right direction if they're stuck.
Yeah, I would just add to that our approach actually when we work with clients doesn't really differ, whether it's kind of very tangible practice, kind of very malleable learning objectives, or something less concrete. So I know I talk to a lot of potential customers who want to work with us, and a lot of them want to start with, okay, are we doing aliens or are we doing dinosaurs? And we actually back up the conversations as we first focus on outcomes. So whether that's learning objectives so that the student understands addition, or if it's like students understand or are enabled to show empathy practices. And from those objectives or goals of the experience, we think a little bit about assessment, how we're going to measure them. And then from there, we try to develop kind of games, game tool, game mechanics that serve those two paradigms, both the objectives or outcomes and assessment needs.
Yeah, you know, to build off that, I think we would be remiss in answering this question if we didn't talk about the impact of platform as well, because the medium in which you consume the game or the simulation, I think impacts a lot about what it means to teach a soft skill like creativity or a soft skill like empathy. I'll give you an example. If you are asking me to create a game about empathy for a VR platform, that platform has very different affordances than if you were asking me to create that same game or experience with those learning objectives on a tablet. In a VR space, I can offer an embodied experience, so I can make the player feel like they are somebody else or someplace else, perhaps to a higher degree than I can if they're looking at a removed screen. So I have different set of tools to impart that particular learning objective or those learning objectives than I would if I was on a different platform. As far as creativity goes, there's, and I'm completely blanking on the name of the painting app. Yes, Tiltbrush, thank you. You could also make an argument about the affordances of painting as an embodied player in Tilt Brush compared to painting in an Adobe Suite program, and the potential impacts that that would have on creativity. I like to think maybe there's a lower barrier to entry for somebody who is interested, or you know, if you're trying to indoctrinate somebody into the mindset of a creative person, but you don't want them to be hampered by the steep learning curve that you might get with an Adobe Photoshop or a program like that. So the platform definitely makes a difference. We're working on a game right now called RoboEngineers, which is a game where you can build robots in virtual reality. It obviously is an awesome opportunity for players to flex that creativity muscle. But I think you could, that's an example in the opposite direction, where I don't think the platform has that significant an impact as far as the creativity learning objectives are concerned and specific. I think you could have that. I think you can build robots on a tablet or a computer screen and still have an experience that gets your creative juices flowing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that explanation. So you both touched upon this a little bit. Would love to get some more detail on measurement, data, and metrics. We're obviously living in the big data age. Everyone wants to see something successful. There's not always metrics for everything. As you mentioned, empathy. Would love to get some more detail on how you tackle the measurement aspect of whether a player or a student has succeeded in learning and how much he or she has done so.
And what was the last part of that?
How much they've learned and sort of how you measure that education that they've gained, or if you do that.
Sure. The answer is we do some of the times. It depends on, it's really a question of the client's preferences. Some clients care a lot about that. Some clients don't care at all about it. There are many different instruments for measuring what a person knows. Now I'm just speaking in general terms, not even about game-based learning. Most of them are still relatively primitive. The most sophisticated ones still involve asking the person questions before they have an experience, and then again after they have an experience. One of my favorite ones to date is interviewing experts in the domain that you're teaching, and then figuring out how those experts, based on those questions or those interviews, figuring out how those experts think about the world and how they value their own expertise, and then translating those things into measurements of mastery or measurements of progress, and then applying that to the novices who are you're teaching through your learning instrument. With game-based learning in specific, we have a couple more tools available to us, because games are, everything you do in a game is an action that can be recorded in some way. So what we saw in the early days of game-based learning, I mean, we're still in the early days of game-based learning, but what we have seen previously is an attempt to report out everything that a player does in the game as learning data. And what we know now is that it's very easy to overwhelm whoever is assessing that data or trying to measure the learning with data from gameplay. And since the early days, we've come up, I think, with more refined ways to report out interesting and, more importantly, useful data from the gameplay experiences. And of course, that can take many different forms. Some very common metrics that are reported out are progress in the game, because that, you know, whether or not the person got to level 3 versus level 7 says something about the learning experience. One of our favorite metrics at Filament is picking out particular game mechanics or actions a player can take, and then tying those to particular learning objectives or standards. Mm-hmm. And then we can make a claim, if the player did things X, Y, and Z in the game, that there is a correlation to standard or learning objective A, B, or C. Again, we're not making a claim that the player has mastered those things. We're just saying they did things in the game that suggest that they were exposed to those ideas or those concepts, or had an opportunity to play with those ideas or those concepts.
Yeah, one of the things, we often have these conversations with our potential clients who are most likely coming new to game-based learning. And one of the things that comes up often is there's this desire to capture data on things, on did they get it right the first time? Let's keep metrics on how fast they did it, or how quickly they got through the levels. And we always caution, because of course a well-designed game is meant to be a space for experimentation. So if kind of the social contract you make with a player when they enter a game space is that you can have a number of tries, you can poke around the edges, you can try different strategies, you can just kind of hang out there for a while if you're just having fun, like, I don't know, not tapping on the trees or meeting the animals. Like there's a social contract that this is a safe place and you can obviously play in that space. So if clients do want to work or they want to use the game as an assessment, one of the first rules is to make it very clear to the player that this is not a safe place. Like this is not a place for experimentation. This is like literally an assessment so that they know at least the context that they're going to be entering the experience and they can try to deliver on those expectations.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that because there's a huge difference between play and performance. Yeah. Imagine the difference if, between going on a stage to deliver a speech or do a webinar, for example, if you get one shot versus being able to do it as many times as you want. Obviously, in the latter category, you're going to experiment. You're probably going to intentionally fail, which from my perspective is a great learning opportunity. Not that I'm doing that right now because it's a performance, but you have an opportunity to poke at the system, right? When it's playful as opposed to performance oriented. And it is in the process of poking at that system that I think you hit most of the learning objectives when you're talking about game-based learning. So to give that up in the name of focusing on summative assessment or performance-oriented assessment, it is a big sacrifice from our perspective.
Fantastic. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's something you said about the experience of something and not just sort of the end point and what you learn by doing that experience, either do well or not, to say. Another question we have, and then we'll switch over to audience questions that are coming in live as you guys are talking, is accessibility concerns. So VR is fantastic, it's cool, it's in, everyone's talking about it, but if you don't have glasses, you can't really access all the amazing content that's coming on. And the price points are obviously ranged from point A to point B, but it's not as accessible as cell phones are, say, or computers or iPad or tablets are. How do you take that into account as you're designing VR experiences, especially in
Yeah, it's a legitimate question, and I mean the easiest answer is we should just wait because the price is dropping very quickly. Oculus recently cut their price basically in half. I expect the Vive to be cheaper in the next iteration as well. All the big HMD developers, I shouldn't say all, the vast majority of them have some solution, some all-in-one solution that'll be a mid-price option, like for example, like the Focus coming out or the Oculus Go, and where the price point is significantly more achievable than you get with the high end, like the Vive and the Rift right now. So that's all coming down. The price of the devices is in large part driven by the price of the screens, and of course the goal with VR is to continue to make the screens higher and higher resolution, and that R&D, the R&D that's contributing to those advances is happening irrespective of VR, because it's the same R&D that drives the cell phone industry. And so as a result of that, the quality will continue to go up while the price continues to go down. That is inevitable. But yeah, right now it's still expensive. And so if you, and we feel as a developer who is developing two games that we own the IP to and we'll try to distribute into the VR market, we feel we feel that pain point very sharply, because the audience right now is not as big as we would like it to be if you were to compare it to, say, the console install base or PC or tablet install base. But what matters from our perspective is what the trends look like. How is the adoption base of VR growing relative to other similar technologies in the past? So you can compare it to, say, the adoption curve for cell phones, the adoption curve for laptops, Chromebooks, tablets, whatever. And it's kind of hard to describe this without actually showing you the visual, but the adoption curve for VR recently did stagnate a little bit, and that was concerning to us and concerning to obviously the hardware players in the industry. But we're starting to see it pick up again, and I think this holiday season will obviously have a big impact, and the release of a whole bunch of new, more affordable options will have a significant impact as well. So I think this is just sort of one of those waited out kind of things, and I think it'll actually happen faster. Well, I shouldn't say faster than we expect, because there are a lot of people who are forecasting very aggressive adoption curves for VR. But I don't think we're going to be having this same conversation in a couple of years.
Yeah, I just have two things to add. And one of it too is the question of content. Like, is the adoption slowing down because people don't see the need to have particular content? Right now, most of the content that's being developed is actually fully or partially subsidized by the hardware manufacturers, because as a developer, like, the time and effort and money you put into developing the content would be very difficult to reclaim. So we're going to get to the point where I think there's going to be enough players and the devices are going to be at a consumable price point that it will make sense developers to go and kind of develop on their own to create more content till we get to the point, you know, much like the App Store today, that there's thousands of apps being added every day, that we are now overwhelmed with content. I think the second thing I wanted to add is a shout out to everyone who's working on accessibility to VR right now. I mean, there's some amazing things happening. Like, literally at my children's school, the librarian wrote a grant to get 3 kind of Viewmaster headsets, and then had a phone drive with parents to hand over their own phones so they could load some experiences on it for the equipment. I love public spaces that have embraced VR. So shout out to the VR lab in Boston as being one of the first that they have public days where members of the community can just come in and try different experiences, kind of thinking of it more as a lab or a museum. And then I'm really shout out to like the libraries and media centers. I know this year Wisconsin has always had a fund for schools, for rural schools to invest in technology. And this year they have opened up the call to include VR equipment. So yeah, so I'm excited by, oh, and then the other model I've seen is kind of more of a VR field trip that comes to your school. So either it comes on a bus or with a bunch of people, that it's more like a field trip that you can have, you know, for a few days in your school. So I don't know. I think as all things, like, people are trying to make it work and kind of bring that to people as they can. But I think it's going to shift a lot.
Lord. No, it's great. That's great. The next we have you also. That's the best conversation where you're touching upon questions that came from before. So the barriers to adoption in classrooms or in schools for VR and for games in general. So you touched upon school, you touched upon librarians getting excited, parents giving their phones. So maybe there aren't that many barriers. Maybe that's the question that always comes up in these conversations: does everyone want to adopt it? See more as entertainment and less as educational. So any barriers that you've come across with schools or educators and how you've overcome them, or if you haven't and people have been excited about this new technology?
Well, I'd just like to say that while I admire the hustle, it is not a full solution. There are still plenty of barriers to adoption. I don't know if you want to go through them.
Are you speaking about VR in particular, or just game-based learning in general?
I think the question was barriers to VR in the classroom. But if you want to talk a little about game-based learning in general as well in the classroom space, that would be helpful as well. I think that's a parallel conversation.
Yeah. So we let's see. This was maybe 6 to 8 months ago. We conducted a series of interviews with technology coordinators, educators and administrators about virtual reality in the classroom and in schools in specific, to try to understand from their perspective what the value proposition was and what their plans were, and whether or not they had any VR hardware in their school or institution currently. And what we learned was there are, as you would expect, there are a lot of early adopters who are diving in headfirst and purchasing hardware, some of it high, some of it middle, some of it low end. along that continuum from the cardboard all the way up to touch. And they're doing that based on the idea of what VR can do, or the vision about what VR could do, as opposed to any particular application or content. And I applaud those people. Those people, whatever new technology comes out, there are always going to be some educators or technology coordinators on the cutting edge trying to figure out what the implications are for learning. So that's happening right now, and will continue to happen. As far as larger scale adoption goes, I will say that one thing that VR has in its favor is that it is hardware based right now. It's hardware driven, which is to say that if you want to bring VR solution into your school or institution, step one right now is to actually buy some headsets. And schools, historically, it is easier for schools to purchase hardware than it is for them to purchase software, in the age of software being very low cost and in many cases free, especially for education. Hardware has maintained its value and its perceived value in a way that I don't think software has in the institutional space. And so I think a lot of the adoption that we're seeing right now, and we'll probably continue to see in the near term, is hardware driven. There's a new set of hardware in my makerspace. I can point to it. I can say, this is what that budget line item went to. There it is. It's tangible. It's making an impact. It's harder to do that with software. So the hardware is kind of the foot in the door. And then it's really up to us software developers to try to follow it in or capitalize on instances where schools have adopted the hardware. And the big challenge there is that normally, I should say this is both a challenge and an opportunity. Normally, if you're trying to sell a new solution to a school that's software-based, you have to have a critical mass of solution, because if you're going to make ends meet, you have to be selling at the school or district level. And in order to do that, you have to have a solution that covers a lot of content, just to oversimplify things a little bit. But when something is brand new, in fact, when it's so new that there's maybe one or two applications for it at the time that it's purchased, I think it's easier for purchasers in schools and districts to justify that one-off purchase of that one game or those two new games, as opposed to having to think about solutions that are going to cover entire subjects or entire grades. So that is an opportunity that Filament intends to capitalize on, that I've seen some other organizations capitalize on as well. And I think that once you have, those are the things that drive you to the point of having a sustainable adoption base that then creates ample justification for other developers to throw their hat in the ring and make that investment. But probably in the near term, most of the people who are developing educational applications for VR in schools will also probably be developing them for the consumer market, probably even first for the consumer market, with the idea that they can get some replay value in the institutional education market. I also know that there's, all of the hardware manufacturers that stand to live or die based on the sale of hardware recognize the importance of institutional education as a piece of the puzzle. It's a huge market, and this is everything from the organizations who are making the chips that drive the hardware to the organizations that make the hardware themselves. They all are thinking about how to get into schools in a big way. And I can say that they haven't figured it out yet, but they're thinking very hard about it. And I think that they will probably focus on that more in earnest once they have a more solid foothold in the consumer space, because the foothold in the consumer space right now is still a little bit shaky. Mm-hmm. So they're probably concerned about dividing themselves too thin, but I can definitely confirm that there are a number of very big players in the hardware space who care a lot about institutional education and figuring out how to sell a whole bunch of VR in institutional education.
Sure. As you were saying, so the hardware, software as well, the hardware producers are also interested in better content coming out, because then again, that's used. So I think that it's good play there. I think there's a lot of collaboration. Really, it's a space that's building and growing every day. Another question that's come in is interesting. I haven't seen it before. VR obviously is a growing field. It's increasing every year. Ethics in VR. What is the role of ethics in the VR, AR, XR space? Have you dealt with that, especially dealing with students and children? Is that something that's a concern? Any detail or color you could add there would be interesting for our listeners.
I would just say, I mean, having now spent quite a bit of time in VR, it's the first medium that treats identity in our games no longer as a kind of joint identity between us and the player. It's actually it's a merged identity where we are literally designing experiences and asking people to put their bodies in it and to see through eyes that we have created a world for their consumption. So while that's super exciting as a developer that makes educational and game for impact, it's also a huge amount of responsibility, because I think there's kind of initial impressions, and this latest round of VR, like the research has started in earnest and it's coming out in drips and drabs, but we haven't been doing it long enough to really realize what the impacts of doing that. So I think it's really interesting, the different ethical questions, but one of them is just, creating a learning experience in a world that we are literally like the puppet master of, and the responsibility that comes with that.
Yeah, so Jennifer is speaking to the psychological impacts. A lot of times when you talk about ethics in VR, there's concern about the physiological aspects, particularly for children. And I did a fair bit of research into this just because I was really excited to get my own kid into VR when it became available. And everything, this is still all very formative, but from what I understand, this is the deal. The concern is about the development of the ocular nerve when a small child whose ocular nerves are still developing is focusing on a screen for an extended period of time. And it is a concern, but it's a concern regardless of whether or not the screen is 2 inches in front of their face, or a tablet 2 feet in front of their face, or a television that's 10 feet in front of their face. So the issue is not necessarily with VR in specific, but with an abundance of singular focus depth screen time. And there's still a possibility that VR is actually better than those other focal issues, because when you look at a tablet or a television or a computer screen, your eyes are focusing at one particular focal depth, whereas VR creates the sensation of real depth. And so I don't think we totally understand yet what the eye is actually doing from a focus perspective when you engage in a VR space. So bottom line is, it doesn't seem like it's any worse than anything else. There's a chance that it could be better, but TBD. And also, I'm not a doctor. Your mileage may vary.
No, those are great answers. Thank you for that. And it's like you said, it's a field that's evolving, so I think that there will be some evolution in this space as well within VR. This is a really interesting question that's come from, I'm guessing, one of our nonprofit viewers. So the Institute also has a big following of nonprofit social impact organizations, which Dennis, you mentioned, or I think Jennifer might have been you, are learning to use VR, AR, and games in general in their work. Any advice you would have for nonprofits to use VR technology, which isn't just for fundraising at their galas? So that's usually the most successful, the most lucrative way you see VR being used is at galas. A lot of groups do a good job at showing their funders, their board, the experiences that they're funding, but other ways that you've seen in your experience, maybe working with schools, and how nonprofits can use VR in a way that's not just fundraising based, but might be educational or behavior change focused as well. Any best case examples that you might know of would be helpful to our audience.
Well, I mean, I guess to draw an analogy, when we started making educational games, most of our clients were either academics or nonprofits, and the space has diversified significantly since then, which I think is a very good thing for the space. But yeah, in the beginning, we were mostly working for mission-driven organizations that were either using the technology to raise funding or raising funding in order to use the technology.
Sure.
And I guess the first thing I'd say is there's certainly nothing wrong with trying to impress your funders with innovation. So that's cool. Keep doing that. Keep showing VR at the gala. I guess I don't go to a lot of nonprofit galas, so I'm not experienced in this particular space. But I think it comes down to a question of what your ultimate goal is as a nonprofit. Is this a tool to help you raise more money, or is this the mission in and of itself, or is this an instantiation of the mission in and of itself? And that's a very personal question for each individual nonprofit that decides to use VR as a path forward. Our experience working, so we have worked with one nonprofit so far in the VR space. The other organizations that we've worked with in the VR space have been for-profits, which is just to say our experience is limited there. But that nonprofit was using the game that we developed in VR in order to raise money, but then they were going to reinvest that money in the development of a full experience, which was going to be deployed at scale for the purpose of impact. And that sort of brings us full circle to the earlier part of the conversation about accessibility and is this the best tool if you're trying to have the broadest impact possible. And there's all sorts of interesting things to think about there. But I guess if I was trying to use VR for impact right now, it will, and I am, because we were in the process of developing a game called Breaking Boundaries in Science, which is about the life and times and work of three famous female scientists in history, and that will be releasing on the Samsung Gear. So the point I was going to make is, if I was going to be trying to have an impact with VR right now, if you look at the install base numbers, I think you have to go middle or low tier with the VR experience, and that's exactly what we're doing with this particular game. We also have a higher end game that is not for, I guess, philanthropic purposes, and that's where we'll go. That's where we'll target the higher end system.
Yeah, what I always tell people is if you develop content for VR, the drawback is that not a very small number of households in the world actually own VR equipment. The very positive side, though, is you're competing with a lot less content, and the people who do own the equipment are quick to, you will get eyeballs on your experience, and they are more likely to purchase or download your content. So, we're still kind of waiting for mass adoption. But at the same time, if you were to create an app today, you're going to be dealing with continued challenge with discoverability, and you will have to have all sorts of budget just to get your app noticed, whereas it's much, much easier to get noticed as a VR experience, especially a VR experience that is not, shooting someone, like something different than kind of the norm. I think you have a much better chance of getting noticed.
Sure, thank you. I think it's also up to a nonprofit to know if they want to do it, not just want to do it because everyone else is doing it. So I think social media is a good example. What do you want to communicate to your followers? And if the VR is a good fit, then go for it. But if not, then you don't have to just do it because all the cool kids are doing it. Let's switch gears a little bit to a really interesting question that's come in on multiplayer VR experiences. So I think we've talked a lot about single player, one person kind of doing something individually, and the implications for classrooms. Looking at movie theaters and cinemas, a lot of movies are going into the VR space as well. So implications there for multiplayer experiences, people doing something together versus doing it alone. What implications that has for educational VR experiences?
Yeah, I'm personally really excited about multiplayer in VR because I get excited about, since we have made a lot of collaborative educational experiences, both for formal and informal learning environments. I'm a big, particularly in formal learning environments, I'm a big proponent of leveraging the affordances of the context. And in schools, the context is you have a bunch of kids who are physically co-located, and what a shame if they're all sort of off doing things on their own. So yeah, so multiplayer in VR is currently 100% feasible. We just came back from the VRX conference in San Francisco, where I had an opportunity to play my first multiplayer VR game. The thing that was not compelling about it is that while I could see the other people in the game space, I could not interact with them in any meaningful way. So the lowest hanging fruit, right now is that you can create a multiplayer experience where players can see each other. All right, that's cool, better than nothing. But ultimately, I think the power of putting people in the same gameplay space is that they can enhance each other's gameplay experience and learning experience in some meaningful way. And to accomplish that, you have to have people interact, not only interacting with each other, but also interacting with virtual objects collaboratively. So for example, with RoboEngineers, a game that we're developing where you build robots in VR, ultimately we would love it if people could collaboratively build robots, right? Just like they could in a high school robotics program. Super powerful from our perspective. That gets a little bit more complicated technically, but is still feasible. You just have to have more tracking devices to understand where the different parts of each player are so that you can represent that in the virtual world. And then you have to have some pretty fancy networking code to understand what happens when two different people are interacting with the same object at the same time in the virtual space. But it's all achievable.
I also love the idea of making closing the proximity gap in VR. So you can just imagine where right now schools can Skype with astronauts who are in outer space, and probably VR won't work in outer space. But you can think of like an expert being in a foreign land where now they might kind of conference in through Skype, and it feels like the classroom is looking at the TV and communicating someone through this flat surface. But what happens if we can meet kind of these people in VR, where although we might be in different locations, we can all feel like we're actually in the same space. And I think anytime you kind of remove barriers from you and the other person, it really helps with kind of attention and engagement and kind of the personal experience.
Literally, I think that actually that's so important right now, probably more than ever. So it's a great point, the global citizenship piece. Another question that's come up is, I think you touched on it, Dan, challenges while developing RoboEngineers, and sort of what challenges did you? It's obviously a very cool concept. It sounds very complex listening into it, and breaking boundaries as well. I know you had colleagues who met with Jane Goodall, which is fantastic that they could kind of use her knowledge, and as she's still with us. So any challenges there with both those games, and maybe in the VR capacity or not, that you have gone through or might go through as you're still developing both those pieces?
I can start with breaking boundaries. Sure. I think when we first spoke to Oculus and we had pitched them a bunch of ideas, and we had pitched them an idea about going through different periods of time and in science, great moments in science. And it was right around the time Hidden Figures came out. So our contact was like, I love that idea, but what about if we went to go visit like 3 different female scientists? And that our initial idea was you could kind of practice the science, kind of a very Filament game of actually, simulating a lot of the scientific practices. While as Oculus really wanted us to take more of a storytelling route. So they really wanted to focus on what were their early influences, what made them think they could be scientists, kind of what motivated them, what were the challenges they faced. So we really had to think about, like, what does storytelling look like in VR, especially not 360 video, right? We were making a modeled experience. And what does, stories usually happen in a linear fashion. And even if they're cut up and there's flashbacks, it's still kind of a continuum. So kind of how do you tell stories when you present a player with an open space where they could kind of go anywhere and learn anything in whatever order that kind of is interesting to them. So we kind of concept out and prototyped a couple of different pathways to doing storytelling, but eventually we settled on kind of story kind of nuggets, like pieces of story that we can attach to specific objects in the space. So in that way, like no matter what order you pick up an object and kind of learn the piece of information, it doesn't matter what the context was before or after, because all of these objects are inhabiting kind of the same space, which is the original workplace of the scientist. I think the other thing we had to think about was, like, for a while the experience was designed as you were in the body of the scientist. So you were Grace Hopper, you were Jane Goodall, and you were kind of taking that perspective in the experience. And eventually we shifted it because we really wanted, we felt in the storytelling experience, we wanted the player to be themselves very much in the space. And then I will not reveal spoilers, but depending on what happens in the space, you actually have the chance to meet the scientist, who then kind of talks to you in the first person. And yeah, we picked the 3 scientists in collaboration with Oculus, and we were so lucky that Oculus reached out to Jane Goodall kind of for her approval, and not only did she give her approval, but she was so excited about the project that she agreed to voice her character's piece. So when you do the thing in the experience and you make Jane Goodall appear, it's going to be actually her voice that talks to you in the first person about her life.
Yeah, and I can speak to a development challenge for RoboEngineers, which I think is interesting from the perspective that it's unique to both VR development and VR learning development, and that is the level of complexity. So RoboEngineers is a sandbox game, and we're trying to create essentially a virtual robotics program, and robotics is very complex. It has a steep learning curve, and what we have realized through demoing it a number of times is that before anybody can interact with any VR learning content, they have to climb the VR learning curve, which is higher for some platforms than others. You know, for example, the Cardboard has almost no learning curve to climb, but the Rift and the Vive have very steep learning curves to climb. Kids tend to climb them a little bit faster than adults in our experience, but nevertheless, it's there. And no matter how fast kids climb them, if your goal is to use the game in an institutional setting, guess what? At some point, an educator or an administrator is going to have to feel comfortable getting in there and building some robots. And if you can't get past the basic literacy necessary to figure out how to navigate a virtual environment, interact with things in a virtual environment with those new controllers, then you're dead in the water. So that's thing number one, is for educational applications in VR, before we can try to teach really complex things, we're going to need a higher level of across-the-board literacy about how to comfortably navigate virtual environments, and that's still a little ways off. And then the other thing is, in developing that game, there's always this tension between trying to make it so that somebody can get into the game quickly and start doing something meaningful and interesting quickly, versus having a powerful tool and a deep sandbox that allows them to really explore robotics as we think robotics is meant to be explored. So on the one hand, we want people to be able to create just about any kind of robot they can imagine. But on the other hand, we want somebody to have a meaningful experience in the first 5 minutes of being in the VR. How do you reconcile those two things? It's very difficult, and I think will be a challenge for anybody who's trying to create deep, complex, engaging learning experiences in high-end VR systems.
Fantastic. I'm really excited to try both games, but definitely the former. Going from that game, one question that's come up a few times today and before as well is women in tech. It's a question that's very important. It's very timely. It's something that VR being a new space, an evolving space, how do you see a role of female developers, female-owned companies? Fantastic to have Jennifer representing Filament and Susanna heading Games for Change. But what else can this space do, or can different groups do to promote young women, young girls learning about VR and becoming developers, and giving more attention to female developers in this space? Any thoughts there?
Well, the first thing I want to say is what I earlier spoke, my response to the ethical question, which was, you know, like we are entering uncharted domain in terms of we are literally controlling the environment that people see in a very realistic way that fully immerses us. I hope to God that we continue to shepherd and attract and retain a whole diversity of designers, so that that world that we create reflects the diversity that we have in our world. So in terms of, I think what's exciting about VR, it's kind of within tech, kind of a newer, this last permutation. It's kind of now a new industry sector. And it's very different than when Grace Hopper was like inventing the compiler in the 50s. Like, one thing I've been really excited about is there's a lot of there's two very large Facebook groups for women in VR and women VR and allies on Facebook, where makers, creators, developers, sound people who are women and their allies have joined to kind of elevate and promote each other's work, but also kind of provide a forum to kind of discuss issues and kind of highlight what's going on in the industry. I think it's been used, those Facebook groups get used a lot for industry speakers. So when there's, you know, oftentimes VR conference organizers end up in those channels, like actively recruiting female VR speakers. So it's interesting because it's a new industry, but in these enlightened times, I feel like through technology and social media, we can be more connected with kind of like-minded people to kind of try to get it right at the onset, as opposed to, because it's kind of a new sector of the industry.
I can't offer any solutions, but I can say that it is, from my perspective, a very serious problem. And that's just because we got back from a VR conference that was extremely male dominated. So it's, you know, if you want to take that as a sampling of the industry and who's involved, it is absolutely not diverse. And that is a problem, but I do not have a solution.
Okay, so wrapping up our last question in a similar vein, expanding the international footprint of VR. So Jennifer, you touched upon diversity. If we don't look at how diverse our world is and we don't project that, then, you know, what are we doing exactly? We have a very small sort of lens we're looking at. So granted, the US is a leader in VR space and other spaces. Well, we also do have the best of the world here in the US working on these technologies. A lot of our colleagues come from other countries and you know, use this country to kind of create that. How do we expand the international footprint? How do we bring in other markets, other developers, both for markets to sell the products and to use them, but also to co-create with us? Any thoughts or any partnerships you might have had with other countries would be great for us to kind of delve into as our last question.
So this, you know, as a developer, I hate to pass the buck, but this is, at least right now, in large part driven by the hardware manufacturers. So when we were in San Francisco, we were talking with HTC, and their new, the Focus, the new all-in-one HMD is going to be China only in the beginning. And so, you know, obviously we're really excited about releasing content in China. I think people in China will get a kick out of learning about female scientists and building robots just as much as people in the US will. So we're all on board to exploit those opportunities when they present themselves. As far as actively trying to seek out distribution opportunities for content in international markets, we feel like we have the wherewithal to do that for more mature markets, but it's a little bit outside of our wheelhouse for emerging markets or nascent markets like VR right now, because it really is just all about where the install base is, and the hardware developers are 100% in control of that.
Yeah, just add at this conference we were at, I mean, we had distributors from China, as well as like Russia, Europe, South America kind of approach us about like taking our content to those areas. So I know people are thinking about it, yeah, we also met kind of developers and content developers. So many of the headsets of the manufacturers here, but we seeing a lot of like the haptics works is coming out of London for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
We've met several haptics companies out there, so.
Yeah, it is an inherently international space. I mean, some of the, at least one of the big
Tesla suit.
Yes, that's right.
From
At
Europe.
least one of the big players is an Asian-based company,
Yeah.
and there are others around the world as well. From a development perspective, we've talked to VR developers all over the globe as well. So I think it'll progress in the same way it has for the gaming industry, but. With this industry right now, it's just so hardware dependent. That's really the choke point.
No, I think you made a very valid point. That people don't think about it. The software follows the hardware, right? You can make amazing things, but if you don't have to watch it, then it's just sitting there somewhere and you can't experience it. So I think that's something definitely to think about as we're talking to developers, kind of just understanding that their hands are tied a lot of times with developing, but where the hardware developments are going. So any last thoughts before we wrap up, Dan and Jennifer?
Sure. So I'm personally really excited about virtual reality as a medium for teaching and as a medium for positive impact. I think it gives us a whole, as game developers, it gives us a whole new set of tools and affordances to play with that we simply don't have, with other types of screens. And I actually think they're quite powerful tools. The lowest hanging fruit is we can create learning experiences that really benefit from the embodied perspective. So for example, if I want to train a surgeon or a nurse or an electrician or a car mechanic, people who are interacting with the professional space with their bodies, VR is an incredibly powerful medium. But I think we're going to see that, and this is one of the frontiers that we're pushing with RoboEngineers, is that we can create compelling learning spaces, sandbox-based learning spaces, or narrative-driven learning spaces like Breaking Boundaries that are better because they're on VR, even though they don't necessarily have to be, and better in sort of subtle, nuanced ways. And so it's exciting for us because we feel like we're on the frontier of kind of understanding what the benefits and costs and affordances are, and then B, trying to apply those in the service of teaching, learning, and impact, and seeing what works and what doesn't. And of course, when augmented and mixed reality comes onto the scene in a very real way as well, of course, it'll amplify that significantly. So it's a super cool time to be a developer, and I think we are, despite all of the concerns that we've talked about with adoption and accessibility and cost, all that stuff, this technology is here to stay. It will get better year after year, and there will be a point well within our lifetimes when it's extremely commonplace for people to have I'm not going to use the word holodeck, but it's just a nice cultural touch point that everybody gets, but like extremely immersive, engaging, high quality learning experiences that you just absolutely could not facilitate without this technology. And we're excited to chart the path between where we are now, where things are still a little bit clunky in early adoption years, to that point where it's one of the most powerful learning tools on our belt.
Yeah, I would just add, so everything what Dan said, plus, I mean, from Filament, we have a very open-minded approach to the different fidelities of headsets between 3DoF and 6DoF. We think there's actually value to all all the permutations of VR, and kind of, especially for learning, there's different built-in mechanisms and not tricks, but affordances of the different headsets. So we just encourage everyone when they're thinking about VR, like there's definitely different pros and cons to each kind of level of fidelity, but there's just something valuable in all of them. So keep developing and thinking about all the platforms, because there are definitely pros and cons to all of them.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Very educational and very informative webinar. It's my first one. I can ask for a better. Thanks for being pioneers in this space and being so honest on the front. I think you helped a lot of people think through what that they're doing, and also organizations who want to use the work. So, and thank you so much to our listeners as well for sending the fantastic questions. Stay tuned to our social media newsletter for our next webinar, and we'll see you guys then. Thank you so much. See you guys soon.
All right.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Hey, right on the dot.
Yeah.
Nice.